Okay, welcome to our Erev Shabbat Parashat class, Parashat Mishpatim, leading off the Jewish slave. Finally, the dust settles, Ma'amad Har Sinai, the revelation of Mount Sinai, the Aseret Deberot, and we've been introduced to Am Yisrael, the Torah Kedusha, the divine document from Shamayim, and we're ready now after we are exhaling from the Aseret Deberot presentation to get into the meat of the matter, to start enumerating and digging into and unfolding all of the Mizbot of the Torah. And Elah Mishpatim, and here they are, says Hashem to Moshe Rabbeinu, and leading off, battering first is the Jewish slave. Now, obviously, in a certain time and place, this was thousands of years ago, this was very much a part of Jewish society and not as inapplicable as it is today. It's not something that's a negligible law, obviously. It was part of the functioning of Jewish society. People had to be sold into slavery either because of their debt or because Bedin sold them due to their acts of thievery, which they couldn't pay back, etc. So it's part of life. However, of all of the 53 Mitzvot and Parashat Mishpatim, which are a code of civil and ethical laws of dealing in monetary manners and many Ben Adam LaHavero interactions, and for that matter, of all the other laws in the Torah, after the Aseret Deberot, it would seem that there could be something that is more impactful, more compelling, more inspiring than the Eved Ivri, than to start enumerating the rest of the Mizbot of the Torah with the Jewish slave. So this is a question that I would imagine that this coming Shabbat, many rabbis from their pulpits or in their classes will ask this question. After all, the first pasuk in a parasha always gets focused on more than others. But I want to add on to that issue with probably a less frequented problem. And that is the second word of that mizvah, ki tikneh, when you purchase an Eved, or the second word of that description, Eved Ivri. This is the first time as a Jewish nation that an individual is called an Ivri, an individual Jew is called an Ivri. It's a word, it's a description seldomly used, right? The adjective that we're used to describe Jews are Yisrael, is Yisrael. A female Yisraelite, a group or a nation, Bnei Yisrael, Am Yisrael, right? So really, if you think about it, if you were rewriting the Torah now with Hashem's permission, you may think of Ki tikneh Eved Yisrael. That would be the conventional terminology to use to describe a Jewish slave. Why is the word Ivri, Hebrew, used? We just got used to it. So this is a rarely used title, and I think a not so often asked question as the conventional question of why start with this mizvah of the Jewish slave. So Ora Haim, commentary on Torah, has some very intriguing theories in terms of the Ivri terminology used, the Hebrew slave. And all of them point to the fact that it might be inappropriate in the context of this mizvah being paired with that word Eved, slave, to throw in that word Yisrael. Perhaps just simply because we don't want to associate Yisrael with Avdut. For goodness sake, we just left Avdut in Mitzrayim. We don't want servitude and Yisrael, our priestly, our exalted, our prestigious nation, to be paired with that word, Eved, right? So Eved Yisrael, not so nice. Further, Or HaChaim looks into the etymology of the word Ivri. And there are several other roots that Ivri reflects. One of them is an avera, la'avor, to transgress, sin. And part of the reason why an Ivri might be sold into slavery is because of his sin of thievery, as we mentioned, and he can't pay the double in some situations or even more. And in order to pay that off, he's sold into slavery. And so that to use the word with Yisrael, to use Yisrael would have been less appropriate, but to use Ivri, Avad, the sin that's connected to this person is perhaps more appropriate. Yet another root in the etymology of this word is la'avod, which means to pass, passing, fleeting. And indeed, to say an Eved that's a Yisrael, of course, doesn't imply we're a permanent nation, a temporary nature. But Ivri, la'avod, fleeting, of course, we know the laws of Eved Ivri has it so that in a standard situation, it's 7 years, or even if he decides to stay longer and goes through the ritual, it's only going to be until Yovel, the Jubilee year. So Eved Ivri, says the Or HaChaim, has several reasons why it's an appropriate terminology and adjective to go with Eved. Let's leave the Ivri term on the side for a moment, and we'll return to addressing it. And let's instead, right now, address the primary question, why start with this mitzvah? And asking that question, we can really compound that question with a related one. And that is, if you think about it, it doesn't really make sense to say, ki tikneh Eved Ivri, because you don't buy a slave. A person only falls into the status of a slave after you've bought him. Post-purchase, he becomes a slave. So you never buy a slave, you buy an individual, and due to the purchase, he is now categorized as a slave. There's such thing as buying an Eved. What does that mean? Ki tikneh Eved Ivri. You think about that question? As we buy a Jewish slave. No. As you buy an individual who becomes a slave. So both the Kli Yakar and Or HaChaim to some extent mention that this alludes to a very profound idea. And that is that it's really impossible for a person to, in a conceptual way, to own a Jewish slave. And that's because at the end of Parashat Behad, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells us something they would already know. Ki li b'nei Yisrael avadaihem asher oseti otam es Mitzrayim. They're mine. When I redeemed them from Egypt and their slavery and servitude, I really redeemed them in order to subject them to another type of, you can say, subordination, and that is me. They're my slaves, avadaihem. So I'm sorry, you'll never be able to buy someone, transform them into slavery, and be, so to speak, conceptual on a conceptual level, their owner, because they're already owned. And so therefore, really, when you buy ki tikneh, an Eved, he's already an Eved Ivri, he's already an Eved of God. Right? So you're actually, conceptually speaking, never buying a slave. And that idea, it sounds cute, really, but that opens the door for really what becomes a foundational mitzvah in the Torah, this Eved Ivri, the Jewish slave discussion. And that is because it represents the idea that there is a certain level of obedience, the fact that we are subject to, the fact that we are slaves, we're in servitude, and really devotion and commitment and dedication to a master, to a creator, to a leader of the universe, and that's our God. And so that the word Eved really connotes this idea that I am subservient to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and therefore is the perfect and appropriate mitzvah to start speaking about all other commands, obligations to God, commitments to God. It starts with understanding that I'm an Abed, and indeed that Ramban points out in a powerful way that this is a foundational mitzvah. This foundational mitzvah is a microcosm of the idea of remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim. Remember that we were Avadim in Mitzrayim. We have to remember Mitzvah Aseh every day of our lives in a big way on Pesach, right? So this, again, microcosmic and smaller life mode of slavery is always a commemoration for us that there's no such thing as really slaves besides the slave of God, and we do free. And hey, you remember when we were slaves, in fact, in a very real way, what happened. And this becomes a Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim. And not only that, says the Ramban, if you look at the 7-day limitation, what does that, what concept, what incredibly foundational idea does that allude to? And of course, the 7 days of creation and Shabbat. And in a bigger way, the Shemitah, the sabbatical year. And in a more large-scale concept, it's the 7th of the 7th, which is the Yovel, all implying the very same idea, creator, a controller of the universe. And so therefore, this, what we thought, so to speak, benign mitzvah, and maybe inappropriate to be leading off and start off the Parashat of Mishpatim and the rest of the mitzvot of Torah, is the most appropriate and possibly the only one you can choose to begin with. For it implies that God is our Redeemer, reminds us of Yetziat Mitzrayim and our dedication to Him, and that God is our Creator, and reminds us of who is the true controller and to whom everyone are slaves. Now that we have that in mind, let us return to the Ivri word. If we really want to appreciate how Ivri and why Ivri is used here, we have to reflect back on the few other times in Torah, Shebichtav, that the word Ivri is used. Now, sometimes it's used to speak about us as a grouping. Am Israel, as it was in the stories of Yosef, where Ivrim, Hashem, from Moshe, in fact, told Paro that Elohei ha'Ivrim nikra alenu, the God of the Ivrim. But let's just leave those, let's say, more national references or ethnic references aside, and let's just look at the few times in the Torah that Ivri, an individual, is labeled an Ivri. Of course, the first and the most well-known is, as a few are mentioning here on the table, and that is Abraham Abinu, after post the war of the Melachim, of the kings, where Abraham is being told by the Palit, by the surviving officer, the bad news that, hey, Lot is taken captive, this nation, this alliance of 4 nations led by Kedula Omer has been guilty of atrocities of war. When he approached Abraham, it says, Vayabo ha-Palit, Vayaged la-Abraham ha-Ivri. Addressed him for the first time. One of us, the first one of us, our father Abraham, was addressed as an Ivri. The other time, and this is not an actual Chumash reference, but it's a Tanakh reference, and that is the book of Yonah, Yonah the prophet himself. When he ran away from the prophecy and he's on that boat, and there's a storm and it's rocking, and they're afraid it's going to capsize, and the sailors, tell everyone, well, you got to pray, and they go down. This guy is snoring away. Ben Adam Alechan Nirdam, we're about to die, and you're sleeping. Who are you? Identify yourself. And he takes out his ID card, and Yonah Navi says, Ivri Anochi, I'm an Ivri, and the God of the heaven, of the earth, do I fear. He identified himself as that. Now let's look at these 3. Abraham Abinu as Abraham ha'Ivri. Here we're speaking about an Abid Ivri, and Yonah called himself an Ivri. Is there a common thread that binds all these together? And if you look back at the first mentioning with Avraham Avinu, from where this term began, and try to understand why this Palit, this officer of war, this survivor, was addressing him as Ivri. The Midrash, Bereshit Rabbah, gives three different possibilities, but it's the third that really resonates with me and should resonate with everyone the most. And it's really absolutely profound. And that is using the word, not the two roots that we mentioned previously, rather Eved as in side. And says the Midrash, he's calling him Evedi because Kol ha'olam me'eved echad, the entire world were on one side, and he's me'eved achid, and he's on the other side. Avraham Avinu only took upon himself the revolution of God on planet Earth, only flipped mankind on its back, and only changed the world permanently forever by reintroducing HaKadosh Baruch Hu to it. And Avraham was bold enough to stand on the other side, so to speak, of the world on his own. A Renaissance man, a man unafraid and bold and brave enough to speak what he believed in, and not just that, preach it, recruit it, spread it, disseminate it, and get it out there. That there's a creator, a single one of this in this world of ours. And that's why the Palit says he came to Avraham Ha'ivri, the one that's different, the one that teaches and preaches godly values. Let me address this man. And that truly is why, of course, Yonah identified himself as Ivri. You guys are gonna be taken for a loop over here, but I'm different. And that's why this boat is rocking right now. I'm an Ivri, and I'll be treated very differently than you might be treated or anybody else. And of course, in our parasha, this term, Ivri, basically distinguishing ourselves from Goyim, from other cultures, from other peoples, from other ways of thought, is paired with this word Eved. If you're going to be a proper Eved, if you're going to be subservient to God, if you're going to be committed to Him, starting from Yetziat Mitzrayim and moving forward, then you have to know that you have to be an Evedi. You have to be one that's willing to stand on the other side, to distinguish yourself from the cultures of the world. And that becomes the starting point for all other Mishpatim. Because not only do we start the laws by subjecting ourselves to them, understanding that we're an Eved of God, but we also start them understanding that these laws are laws because Hashem said they're laws. And this ethical code, so to speak, these moral dictates that you're going to see in Mishpatim, they are not subjective, although you would think they might be. There's no flexibility in them with time. They're not relative to societies and cultures. They're the only absolute dictates and truisms that exist on earth. They're the Torah Kedosha. It's the perfect moral code. And that's because we're Ivrim. We stand on the other side. We're uninfluenced, we're unimpacted by the ongoings in this world because we're committed as Avadim to the one single God. And therefore, where it seemed to be somewhat trivial to begin a Parashat Mishpatim with an Ivri, becomes the irreplaceable Mizvah and term for which to start all the other listing of Mizvot Torah. The Ivri, the committed servant of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who stands on the other side, different from the rest of the world. Shabbat Shalom, Baruch Adonai L'Olam, Amen.